You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
And we're back with another of our occasional Q&A episodes, Todd. So we get lots of questions, comments from our viewers. We love hearing from everybody. Some people post questions on our YouTube channel. Some people directly email them to us.
Yes.
And what we tend to do is we tend to sort of save them all up. And every now and then we'll sort of do a Q&A episode and try and just get through as many of these questions as we can in the hour. So that's what we're planning to do again today. And I think we've got some good questions lined up. Now, Todd, we recently recorded another Q&A episode.
Yes.
We didn't get anywhere near finishing all the questions that we had on our list.
Correct.
But as we were sort of preparing to record this episode, you said to me, I can't remember the questions that I answered last time.
Correct.
So,
yeah. I just did it off my phone, right? And I didn't keep track. I was just keeping track in my head of what I did. So I am completely unprepared for this episode. So I'm entirely at your mercy.
Well, that's okay. Fortunately, as we went along last time, I did tick the questions that we answered. So
I'm glad somebody is paying attention to that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I do have this list, and I know which ones we did. So I'm gonna then ask you to start us off, Todd.
Yeah.
And
sure.
I'll throw open this first question to you. And it relates to our episodes about biblical chronology. And, the genealogies.
Yes.
We had lots of questions about those episodes.
Mm-hmm.
This is an interesting one. So this is something that we've all come across, I'm sure. The question is, what do you think of the claim that the overall lifespans in the genealogies, and I guess the question is specifically thinking of Genesis 11, that the overall lifespans match a biological decay curve? They say, I've heard several creationists make this claim. It does seem like a convincing argument for these being real lifespans, not the invention of a clever writer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. So, Todd, what do you think about this?
All right. Well, before I answer, let's remind everybody to like this episode and subscribe and click that bell. Do all the things that you do. Share it with your friends. Share it with your enemies. Whatever you got. All those little things help us grow our channel. And we try to remember to do this every opening of the episode, but sometimes we forget.
Yeah, I forgot. So,
but you know what? As long as one of us remembers, it just doesn't matter, right? So, all right. So the lifespans of Genesis 11. So you recall we talked about and I'm going to answer this in a really weird context, but we're going to get there. We're getting there. So hold on. So you remember the different manuscript traditions that we talked about in that series. There was the Masoretic tradition, which is the what most Protestant Christians in America would probably think of as the Hebrew text of the Bible.
Yeah.
That has one set of numbers. There is a Septuagint tradition, which is different. And that is the Greek translation that was made a couple centuries before Christ appeared. And then there was the Samaritan tradition. Now, the Septuagint tradition tends to stretch out the chronology. The Samaritan tradition tends to compress it pretty significantly. And one of the things that we noted as we were talking about those traditions was that the timeline alterations, particularly in the Genesis 5 chronology, the pre-flood chronology, tend to be systematic in a way that make a certain amount of sense, right? So we noted, for example, the Septuagint adds a century to some of the ages at which the patriarchs begat their children.
Yeah.
So that the effect would then be to stretch out the actual time span between creation and the flood. And then, so that's a very systematic way of thinking about things. It's not sort of a random modification. It is very clearly, deliberately 100 years difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic. So you can start to think,
right,
somebody deliberately modified things. Either somebody along the line copying the Torah decided to remove a couple of centuries, or somebody, making the Greek translation decided to add them. Whatever.
Right.
Okay. The other thing that we noted in that series was that the modifications to the post-flood are far less systematic and hard to understand. So that's my preface to my answer.
Okay.
There is no doubt that the total lifespan of the patriarchs given in the Masoretic text can be fit to an exponential decay curve fairly well.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I'm not so sure. I honestly don't even know if that's the case for the Septuagint or the Masoretic. I know that it's the case for the Masoretic. The Septuagint or the Samaritan, sorry. But I know that it's the case for the Masoretic. Okay. So, do I make much of that in terms of significance? I don't know. One of the things that I've noticed, when we talk about this, and I think this is really interesting about the Masoretic, the changes tend to be, how do I describe this? It looks to me like what you would call a step function. So it's not a pure sort of exponential decay. It looks like there are multiple generations that live to be roughly the same length of time. So it goes from, Noah lives to be 900 and something, then Shem lives to be 600, and then I think it goes to 400. I don't remember exactly. This is off the top of my head. I know there's like 3 generations where they live exactly 200 years, which,
right.
In my opinion, strikes me as something biological. It seems to be that something is changing in the genetics of lifespan. And I am imposing upon this text a genetic interpretation that perhaps it cannot bear. But it's intriguing, right? If there were mutations happening, I would not expect them to be happening all the time. And I know enough about life history in modern organisms to know that life history is generally a genetic phenomenon. There is environmental factors that, of course, play a role, but there is a strong influence of genetics. And so when I see this step function in the Genesis 11 lifespans, it does seem like there are particular discrete genetic changes happening that are shortening the maximum lifespan. And I could be completely wrong, right? I could be totally off base. As we know, environment does play a role in longevity. And so, interpreting the Genesis 11 lifespans in terms of genetics is sort of presupposing that these individuals did not meet with an untimely end, right? That they did not,
right?
hit some environmental disaster that caused them to die, or they weren't murdered by anybody or whatever. I don't know. It's interesting, and there's lots of people that make a big deal about it. Look at this beautiful curve, and I just know there's more to longevity than just genetics. I would like to think there's something genetic behind it, but maybe not. And we still, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know. I do not know.
I mean, it sounds to me as if this is an area where more research could be really useful, not least in exploring that kind of step function that you think you sort of discern in the data. And also, I don't know whether anybody has looked at the Septuagint and the Samaritan to see whether similar patterns are present there. That would be interesting. There's all kinds of things that could be done. So that sounds quite interesting. But interestingly, you are not immediately dismissive of this idea.
I am not. I am
intriguing.
I am neither dismissive nor am I enthusiastic. I am cautiously intrigued. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, I hope that's helped us sort of answer that. Let's come on to another question. This one is kind of geological. We got loads and loads of geology questions, particularly related to our episodes, if you remember, about the end of the flood. Mm-hmm. We did a series some time back where we looked at a couple of different positions on where the end of the flood is in the geological record. And you'll remember we had Tim Clarey, who was defending a kind of late Cenozoic post-flood boundary, so quite high in the geological record. We also had Marcus Ross, who joined us, who was sort of talking about a different position where the flood ends a bit lower in the record around the end of the Cretaceous. So in that view, the Cenozoic would mostly be post-flood. And we sort of wrapped it up with some of our own views about all of this. And I think it's fair to say that our personal position is probably closer to Marcus's position. And this sort of led to lots and lots of questions about all of that. And so several of the questions I've got here that remain are actually on that theme. But let's kick off with this one. This is quite an interesting one. So somebody has asked, could the division of the Earth in the days of Peleg have produced massive sedimentary layers? So I think, this is a common question, I think, where people are thinking about potential post-flood catastrophes that might have left a geological signature.
Yes.
And so whether we might be able to explain some of the later parts of the geological record in terms of post-flood events. And people often refer to Peleg. You'll remember that in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25, I think it is, we're told that he was called Peleg because it was in his days that the earth was divided.
Right.
And some creationists have suggested that this division of the earth in Peleg's day was a kind of geological event.
Yep.
That it actually involved the literal division of the land of the earth, maybe sort of continental separation, kind of plate tectonics, or continental sort of splitting, or something of that kind. And so, the question is, could that be a geological event, and could it have been accompanied by lots of, sedimentation and so on? So what's my take on this? Well, to me, I think it hangs an awful lot on an intriguing sort of part of the Bible, but I'm not sure that it's talking about a geological event. I don't think it can be, certainly it couldn't be a geological event, I think, as significant as the flood itself, because the flood, gets 3 whole chapters devoted to it in the Bible. And we're talking here about this sort of almost throwaway reference in Genesis 10:25,
Right.
that suggests that this is not as significant, at least in that sense, as the flood. And of course, Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, is a prelude to Genesis 11. And what do we have in the first 9 verses of Genesis 11 but the account of the Tower of Babel, where the earth is divided, but it's a linguistic division. It's perhaps a territorial division even, based on the confusion of the languages. But it doesn't seem to be describing something that is predominantly geological or, geological. So to my mind, as I think about this, there's nothing really, I think, in Scripture that would drive me to think that this is talking about, splitting of continents or some kind of geographical event, except in the sense that it's referring to the division of the peoples there at Babel. Anyway, that's my take. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts.
No, that is my. First of all, that is my stubborn, my stubborn interpretation of that passage. I think it's very clear. You're reading through Genesis 10, and it's talking about the divisions of the descendants of Noah according to their tribes and their languages. And it's a lovely nested set of statements about, first all 3 of Noah's sons, and then they go through them one at a time, and then it sort of wraps it up. It's a very beautifully composed, self-contained little chapter there. But it does leave you with the question of, well, what happened? How did they divide up? How did they change their languages? Why would they change their languages? And so chapter 11 answers that question with a story that doesn't fit in chapter 10, because that would really disrupt the flow of chapter 10. So, and the other thing I think is that you don't make major doctrines based on one verse.
Right.
That's just a general rule of interpreting Scripture. Don't try to make up a massive doctrine out of a single verse that may not be understandable. In his days, the earth was divided. That's the end. That's the only thing that we have really about Peleg. And so skeptical. I don't want to say, oh, look, this is where plate tectonics happen. That's a massive thing to insert into one phrase in one verse. I don't know. It's quite different from looking at the exhaustive, like you say, the exhaustive description of the flood. Yeah. So basically,
it's also quite hard. It's quite hard, I think, to see how you could have very large scale plate tectonics, kind of the breakup of Pangaea or something after the flood, without it
causing
being a world shattering event causing a flood. So, So I suspect.
Yeah.
So anyway, there we are. Well, we're kind of come to a similar conclusion about that. We had quite a lot of questions as well about natural evil. We've been doing occasional episodes looking at how bad stuff in the biological world came about as a result of the fall. And this is a question about that. So it says, would there have been accidents before the fall? Things like breaks, cuts, bruises? If so, might viruses have played a role in healing? Could their injection devices have been designed to deliver substances like substances to stem bleeding or ease pain, promote healing? Was the fruit of the tree of life also a source of medicines?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
There we are. There's a lot there.
Yeah. So first question is about accidents. Yes, there absolutely would have been accidents before the fall, or could have been accidents before the fall. The world that God made was inherently risky and dangerous, right? Physical life is fragile, as we know. He created the deep, the sea, which is a dangerous thing. He created the dark, which is another dangerous thing. And we see those two things are absent in the description of the new heaven and new earth in Revelation. There is no sea and there is no dark. Jesus is the light. So I think that's very interesting. So yes, I do think there would have been accident in the pre-fall world. It would be inherent to the way God set it up. And we'll have a lot more to say about that in the big book that we're just finishing up the manuscript for right now. So be sure to get yours from your favorite bookstore or whatever. So that is my first question. The second question is, what do you do about accident, right? What would happen if Adam was climbing a tree and fell out and broke his neck? What would you do if a big giant rock fell on Eve and crushed her to smithereens? And the answer is, I don't know. I can imagine a world in which those things could have happened, but were maybe prevented, right? God simply supernaturally intended and prevented those things from happening. I could also imagine a world in which angels would follow everybody around and prevent things from happening. I can imagine a world in which God immediately resurrects miraculously anybody who is accidentally killed. I can imagine a world where, healing is just, as the question says, maybe viruses were used to deliver medicine, or maybe the tree of life was a medicine. Yeah, I can imagine that would be a way to heal unintended accidental damage. And because I can imagine all those things and I have a fertile imagination, it strikes me as not a very interesting thing to dwell on, right? Some people get really excited about thinking about how God structured the pre-flood world so that there would be no accidental death or accidental injury. And I just find myself entirely disinterested because it's thoroughly speculative, and our imaginations are fertile enough to provide countless scenarios of protection from accident. So I don't find myself interested in that question. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just think, from a philosophical, theological, scientific perspective, it does not strike me as a fruitful avenue of inquiry. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Now, could viruses deliver medicine? Of course, yes, of course. We know that. We know that hypodermic needles in the modern world can deliver medicine to heal, or they can deliver drugs that will destroy and maybe even kill. The hypodermic needle is not at fault. And yes, there are parts of viruses and even dangerous bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, that basically have the function of hypodermic needles or other sorts of mechanisms that now deliver toxins, but could deliver non-toxic things. So can I imagine a world in which those things happen? Sure I can. Is there any evidence of it? There are evidences of what's called oncolytic viruses, which I think is a really interesting avenue of research, where viruses have a preferential targeting of cancer cells. So I think that's interesting. But otherwise, I'm not sure I know enough about that question and pathology and pathogenesis to be able to really give it a serious answer. I think it's interesting. I think that's probably a more fruitful route of research than speculating on how God preserved our lives before the fall. So I'm going to leave it at that. There you go.
But once again, I mean, here is an area where creationists could do some productive research.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
This is always interesting to me when we find these things where you think, well, we haven't really explored that very much. And it seems it's sort of ripe for some original thinking.
Yeah.
So that's good. That's good. Okay, well, shall we move on and come back to geology again?
Yes, let's do one for you now.
Yeah, sticking with this theme of the post-flood boundary. And I mentioned earlier that we tend to think that the end of the flood was probably around the end of the Cretaceous, which means that the Cenozoic is predominantly post-flood. This is the uppermost part of the geological column. And somebody asked this question. They said, if the Cenozoic portion of the column could be deposited without a global flood, couldn't somebody contend that the rest could be as well? So I think it seems, the concern here is that, could we, if we can explain one part of the column without the flood, could we end up with a kind of vanishing flood where, all of it ends up being explicable, without a global flood?
So there are people in the history of creationism who have taken the position that most of the fossil record represents post-flood colonization. In fact, there is no flood in the geological record at all.
Or at least it didn't leave a
throw that out there.
Yeah, so it didn't leave a kind of geological signature.
Right, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so how would I sort of address this? Well, I think if you think about the Cenozoic as the period of recovery after the flood, which is kind of how I think about it, I think there's a really interesting story in the Cenozoic of a world that is recovering from the cataclysm, where the intensity of geological processes are declining, where the climate is kind of reaching a new equilibrium, and things are happening, that are consistent with a world that is in recovery, basically. Then I think even if we put the boundary at the beginning of the Cenozoic, you can still see the Cenozoic as at least indirectly the result of the flood, right? Because this is the recovery phase. And you could argue, as we have said before, that we are in a way still in the flood. Yeah. Obviously Noah left the ark, but the world is still recovering from that event. So we wouldn't have the Cenozoic were it not for the flood in that sense. A world that is experiencing a global catastrophe doesn't just automatically, overnight go back to some normal rates of processes. That you're going to have high sedimentation rates and high erosional rates and high levels of volcanism and tectonism and all sorts of things persisting for a very long time afterwards. The other thing I suppose I would say about this is that we would expect to see different things in the post-flood record compared to the flood record. You might expect after the flood for sedimentation to become more geographically restricted. So whereas in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic, we see these continent-spanning flood sediments, in the Cenozoic, things become a bit more restricted, a bit more basinal, a bit more regional. Deposition tends to be sort of more focused around the coastlines and offshore. It becomes more terrestrial. You look at North America and you see marine deposits across the continents in the earlier part of the record, whereas in the Cenozoic, it all becomes a bit more sort of terrestrial in nature, and so that sort of makes sense. So I think we needn't sort of fear that by saying the Cenozoic is post-flood, that this somehow diminishes the geological evidence of the flood itself. I think that is still discernible in the record, even if we don't find that signature of the flood in the Cenozoic. It doesn't mean you don't see it in other parts of the geological column, if that makes sense.
Right.
But this is a huge area of contention and disagreement among creationists. It has been for a long time. You see it in the scriptural geologists of the 19th century, and you see it among creationists today. And it doesn't look as if there's any sort of resolution about to happen. People still sort of vehemently disagree about these things, and I'm sure that kind of disagreement is going to persist.
Probably. I'm going to add a little wrinkle to that. question as well. I have seen, and I've seen this from multiple different individuals who have tried to bring this to my attention, the question of the volume of sediments. That the Cenozoic represents a much greater volume of sediment than we have in the Mesozoic and Paleozoic.
Right.
And therefore, shouldn't we include that in the flood?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll preface that by saying, I don't know if that's true. I have no way of I mean, I suppose I could figure it out if I had a year or two and a lot of unlimited resources. We could figure out what the volumes are, but let's just assume that it's true that the Cenozoic is a greater volume of sediment than the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic. The question to me seems a question of intensity rather than volume.
Mm-hmm.
So the flood lasts a year and produces effectively the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. The post-flood recovery goes on for centuries, which then, even with a greater volume, suggests a much lower intensity of disasters happening.
Right.
So I've never found that argument to be very compelling by that simple, just by that, right? Intensity isn't the same at all. So, of course,
it's also where those sediments are, because there's a difference between finding thick marine sediments across the continents and finding a thick marine deposit in the Gulf of Mexico. Those are different things, right?
They are.
And so it's also about where we find the sediments, how they distributed.
That's right.
Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah. Okay. Another question.
Yeah. Interesting. Another question. Well, this one is about Lucy.
Uh-oh.
So we've we did a couple of episodes where we looked at the your cast of Lucy, and we talked about it. Of course, more recently, we actually went to Prague and saw the real Lucy specimen. But somebody has asked this question. So they say, I have read that Lucy and her species, which is Australopithecus afarensis, had long orangutan-like arms and the hand structure of a knuckle walker. They could walk upright, but also easily swing in the trees. Is this accurate? Well,
I was saving that question for later.
Okay.
But let's talk about that a little bit. Did Lucy have long arms? Not especially. The thing about Lucy's arms that are intriguing, a couple of things about Lucy's arms are kind of intriguing. One thing is that the length of the humerus and the length of the ulna are roughly the same. Now, what in the world does that mean, right? So your humerus is the bone from your shoulder down to your elbow. That's your humerus right there. And then your radius and ulna, they go from your elbow down to your wrist. So if you feel those big sticky outy bones there at the bottom of your around your wrist, that's your radius and ulna connecting in with your wrist bones, those carpals. Okay. Now in humans, our ulna and radius are shorter. Always shorter than the humerus. So, and you can see this by just folding your arm all the way up, and you can see your wrist does not come to the top of your shoulder. Your wrist is actually quite short of your shoulder. And yes, everybody at home, try it now, and you'll find out that that's true. Your wrist does not go all the way to the top of your shoulder. So, the real question with Lucy is a question of proportions, not did she have really long orangutan arms. She did not have really long orangutan arms. They're not some huge, weird, disproportionate arms. They're just slightly different proportions than what we have. Another really interesting thing about Lucy's arm is her shoulder, particularly her shoulder blades. And those were things that we were looking at with SELAM in Prague.
Mm-hmm.
I was very interested to see those beautiful, intact, delicate little shoulder blades preserved from SELAM. And we've got multiple shoulder blade fragments preserved from Lucy's species, Afarensis. And they all indicate that Lucy's shoulder blades were angled sort of upward, right? So our shoulder blades are effectively angled. The shoulder joint itself is angled straight out, horizontal, and so our arms hang down easily. Lucy's shoulder blades are angled upward, so her arms would be more natural to put above her head. So that's been interpreted by paleontologists as being evidence of, some interpret it as being evidence of climbing. And the recent interpretation of Lucy's cause of death as falling out of a tree or some sort of significant fall would also support the idea of Afarensis being climbers. So the Lucy skeleton has damage to its knee. It has damage to one of its shoulders. The humerus on one side is crushed at the shoulder, and the knee joint that's preserved is crushed as well. These are damages that occurred at death. So the suggestion is she must have fallen in order to incur that damage. Okay, so those things sort of suggest that she was a climber. There's a whole other contingent of anthropologists, though, who are very much sort of Darwinian selectionists, who think that if you don't use an attribute, it's going to go away. Natural selection will just eventually eliminate it because you don't use it. And so the idea that she just has, her proportions are different and her shoulder blade is slightly angled, they would say that's not enough evidence to suggest that she was a tree climber, habitual tree climber. And that her bipedal adaptations, her adaptations for walking on two legs, sort of take over and take control and become the focus of selection. Now that's an evolutionary interpretation. Is it right? Is it not right? I'm not really interested in those kind of evolutionary debates. So I'm curious about the arms. They're very interesting. Now the wrist, that's one small feature. This gets repeated a lot by creationists. There's one small feature of the distal radius, which is the bone here, part of the bone found in the wrist that sort of looks like the chimpanzee wrist. The difficulty I have with interpreting that as evidence of knuckle walking is that none of the rest of the features of knuckle walkers show up in Lucy's arms. So one of the big things, and this is really startling, and if I had them here with me, maybe we'll do an episode on this one day. I think it makes sense. The arm bones of a chimpanzee are quite twisted all the time. They are curved in very particular ways because, of course, the posture of the chimpanzee has to turn the hands like this, which is not a very natural pose for us human beings to take. And you might think, I can make that pose. Yes, you can, but it's not convenient. Not like it is in chimps. Chimps are built to do that kind of pose. We're not built to do that kind of pose. We can. It's just not convenient and comfortable. So the twisted arms of a chimpanzee don't look anything like the arm bones of Lucy or other Afarensis skeletons. So Was she a knuckle walker? Probably not. The proportions of her bones don't make sense. The way her pelvis is shaped doesn't look like a knuckle walker. Her arm bones don't look like those of a knuckle walker. So my judgment on that is I don't see anything in the skeleton. That's not true. Not anything. There's one or two things in the skeleton that suggest knuckle walking, but there's a whole lot of other things that suggest no, it's not a knuckle walker. She's not a knuckle walker. And the same would be true for bipedalism. There's a lot of features for bipedalism present in the skeleton that are absent in chimpanzees, which suggests to me that it's probably bipedal. Could she climb? Sure.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's a safe answer.
Interesting. That's an interesting answer. Homo naledi has strange flared sort of shoulder blades as well.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting because Homo naledi in the baraminology analyses comes out with the humans.
Correct.
But also has these kind of weird shoulder blades.
Yes, that's true.
That's very curious.
So I don't know that you this is one of the things that I've learned over the years. You can't just look at one characteristic and say, well, that's it. It's human or not human.
Yeah.
Even a small handful of characteristics, I don't think are enough to tell you human or not human. You need to look at a lot of different characteristics all at once.
Yeah.
And I'm always going to be suspicious with people who tell me it's easy to tell the difference between human and not human. Sure it is. You must not have looked at a lot of hominin fossils then.
Yeah, that's good. Well, it's always been part of baraminology that we try to be holistic and look at the whole organism, not just focusing on one feature or another,
right.
which can lead us astray. Let's move on from there. So here's another question, another geology question, but this is a different topic. So you'll remember in an earlier episode we talked to Dr. Leonard Brand about biotubation.
Yes.
Just to remind our viewers what biotubation is. So biotubation is when animals churn up sediment. So, a sedimentary layer is laid down on the floor of the ocean and it gets colonized by animals. Animals that are burrowing through it to feed or to build their homes or whatever, processing the sediment. And in modern shallow oceans, animals just are, they're prolific and they get to work really quickly and they just churn up the sediments and they destroy any structure in the sediments. And so Leonard had done this interesting survey where he had systematically worked through the geological column,
right,
looking at the intensity of biotubation in formations, and found that actually the level of biotubation intensity was quite low,
right,
which is unlike what you see in the modern day. And so he was sort of saying this is a good argument for rapid deposition, because if there was any kind of time break, any hiatus between these sedimentary units, you would expect very intense biotubation to have taken place.
Correct.
And somebody asked a question about this. So somebody said, sometimes the absence of biotubation is chalked up by conventional geologists to factors such as anoxic bottom conditions. Are you aware of any modern studies on whether lamination and bedding, in other words, structures in the sediment, are preserved under anoxic conditions? So, let's first of all define our terms. So what is meant by anoxic conditions? Well, anoxic conditions are where you have a body of water which is depleted in oxygen. So it might be a very deep marine environment where there isn't much oxygen, or it might be the bottom, say, of a stagnant lake where there isn't much oxygen. And the idea is that where there isn't much oxygen, you're probably going to have fewer animals. And if there are fewer animals, then they aren't going to be biotubating the sediment. So could we explain the absence of biotubation by saying, well, these sediments were deposited in anoxic environments where there just wasn't much oxygen and therefore not many animals? So I think that's a good question. And the answer is yes. Anoxic conditions, where you have low levels of oxygen in the water, do indeed promote the preservation of laminated sediments. That is absolutely true. That is correct. I think what we have to do, though, is to balance that fact with the fact that most of the sediments that we're talking about, most of the sediments that were surveyed by Leonard Brand, don't seem to represent anoxic environments. Okay, they seem to be shallow water environments, shallow marine environments, for example. And shallow marine environments typically have tides and currents that circulate oxygen and prevent anoxic conditions from developing. Now, to give you just one example of this, different formation that I know Leonard and others have studied is the Pisco Formation in Peru, where their attention was drawn by the fact that there is this remarkable preservation of hundreds of fossil whales in the diatomite, this diatom-rich sediment in the Pisco Formation. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the Pisco Formation, there is also a relatively low level of bioturbation. But these sediments were not anoxic sediments. They have sedimentary structures within the sediments that indicate that they were deposited in relatively shallow water, at least only modestly deep water, perhaps, with storms, hurricanes, taking place. There's this thing called hummocky cross stratification that is in the sediments that is typically formed during kind of stormy type environments. So this was not an anoxic environment. This was one where the water was well oxygenated, but we also have this sort of low intensity of bioturbation. And so that's the puzzle. That's the mystery. Why do we have sediments deposited where it's hard to explain why the animals wouldn't be there? In fact, often we know they were there because you can find their fossils, but they don't seem to have bioturbated the sediment. And that is essentially the argument that Leonard was making, that in those kinds of sediments, we would expect 100% bioturbation of the sediment. And we generally don't see that in the geological record. And that seems to be because the sediments were being deposited, on average, much faster than today. There wasn't time for the bioturbators to get to work. So,
and if I may add, even the tiny percentage, sure. I think the tiny percentage of bioturbation that is present in the fossil record does also require some attention, right? Because there seems to be some burrows and things that look like they require time to develop. And so it goes both ways, right? It looks like it's a really good argument for rapid deposition, but then you have these weird places where, all right, well, that looks like it was there for a while. And so then you have to sort of figure out, well, what does this all mean? What kind of a mechanism can we use to explain both the major trend of lack of bioturbation, but then random places where there is bioturbation?
Yeah,
it's a curious business.
And during the flood, sediments were not being deposited at uniform rates throughout. So there would have been times when there was a hiatus and some bioturbators could get to work. But yeah, I mean, it's quantifying then how much time is involved and, how much time do you actually need and how many of these horizons are there?
Yes.
That's the challenge. So,
that's and there's another excellent project for someone to work on to pick up where Leonard and Art Chadwick left off with their survey. I think that's a great next step.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me ask this question now. Somebody sent a set of longer questions that kind of arose from our After the Flood series. You remember we did this sort of thing where we looked at what happened after the flood, and we did a response episode where we responded to some critics of that series. Right. But I kind of saved this one up as well. So somebody had sent a whole load of questions about this camel llama hybrid business. You remember we were talking about created kinds, and one of the clues that we get to what belongs to the same kind is the ability to hybridize. And we talked about camels and llamas, New World and Old World camelids, and amazingly, despite being separated for millions of years in evolutionary terms, they're able to hybridize, and that suggests that not only they're members of the same kind, but they probably didn't actually diverge all that long ago.
Right.
The question that somebody asked was one of a series of questions was about the Dubai program that actually produced that first dromedary llama cross.
All right.
Where they said they looked into that and they said, well, look, that program only produced 5 live animals, all conceived by IVF. So they weren't sort of naturally produced. It was
Correct.
IVF.
Yep.
And none of them went on to produce F2 offspring. So we don't know if they were fully fertile. And the question is this: if the hybrids turn out to be sterile, like mules, would that be evidence against them representing a single created kind under Frank Marsh's hybridization criterion?
Right. No.
No. That's a short answer. Unpack that.
I mean, Marsh directly discusses that in his books, and he thinks it doesn't really matter. For him, the criterion was something called true fertilization. I don't think science was sophisticated enough at that point for him to be more specific on what that would mean. But for him, if you had an embryo develop or start developing, even if it aborted at some point during embryogenesis, that was sufficient evidence that the parents were the same kind. And that was that question was then brought up. Some of our listeners might know there was a group of German biologists in the 90s that produced a book developing these ideas called Basic Types of Life. And they talked about this in great detail, how much of embryogenesis would be necessary for the hybrid to count. And they agreed basically with Marsh that, if you get a live birth, then the parents are members of the same basic type, same created kind. So, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they're fertile. It doesn't sterile. It doesn't matter that they were artificially conceived. None of that's really relevant to the fact that there is a living hybrid with half a set of llama chromosomes and half a set of camel chromosomes. So that's just, that's been discussed by creationists for 80 years, and pretty much everybody agrees, doesn't matter.
Yeah. Now, there were a couple of follow-up questions about camels, and they're also interesting questions. We may have to come back to those. Okay. How much time have we got?
Maybe
have we got
5
for
minutes.
Another question?
Yeah, we got time. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Okay. Well, let me follow that up then with one of these other camel questions then. So the next question is about the earliest evidence for domesticated dromedaries. So it's kind of shifting gear slightly, but
all right.
It talks about the radiocarbon dating of camel bones and harness fittings in that region, sort of in the Near Eastern region, dating around the late 11th to 10th century BC. And the questioner says that would place routine camel husbandry after the conventional dates for Abraham. Rock art camel figures in northwest Arabia are a bit older, but don't show tack or clear human association. So can we reconcile the mention in Genesis 12 of camels with that archaeological timeline?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah. So let's clarify this here. The rock art with camels on it is millennia older on the conventional timeline. We're not talking about just slightly older. We're talking about a long time.
Yes.
Again, on the conventional timeline, if we're going to accept this as being, is there a problem here? The evidence of camel husbandry and domestication, I mean, yes, it's Iron Age. The earliest evidence is Iron Age, but does that constitute proof that there was no Bronze Age camel domestication? I don't know. I guess we would really need to know more about the archaeological record of camels in the Middle East to know, is this exceptional that there is no Bronze Age, there's no known Bronze Age camel domestication evidence, or is it, what we would expect based on remains of camels in, the Iron Age and beyond. I don't know. So, I just find myself deeply skeptical of anybody who says, well, the earliest date we have for X is this. Therefore, that's when it began. I don't think so, right? You have, in order to get something preserved in the archaeological or fossil record, it has to be widespread enough that random preservational mechanisms actually can preserve it, right? Mm-hmm. Archaeology, remember, is just picking through people's trash. And, is there stuff in there from camel domestication or not? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. So I just find myself highly skeptical that the Iron Age is when camels were initially domesticated. And I know that's been a popular argument that's appeared many different places. People being very absolute about it. This proves the Bible is wrong. Abraham could not have gotten camels from Pharaoh. Meh. Not impressed.
Yeah,
I think that's a great overreach of what the evidence I think can actually bear.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. That's interesting. And there were more questions about the camel llama hybrid, so we might come back to those another time. Let's conclude with this question, and it might be something that we both want to sort of chime in on, although it was specifically about geology, really. But I think there are more general principles here. So somebody wrote in, this is great. So your podcast has got me interested in looking into getting into the field of being a creation scientist. I'm thinking about the field of geology. I was wondering what you had to do to get to where you are today, and what steps I need to take to get a job as a creation scientist. I was also wondering if you had any advice for someone like me who's looking at getting into this field for a career. It's always great when students, young people, are interested in getting involved.
Yes.
So we definitely want to encourage you if this is you. Lots of things to say here. Let me start off by saying, if you're interested in getting involved in creation research, first of all, get the best education you can. Go to the best university you can. Study hard. Work hard. Don't see your degree simply as a way to sort of dispute conventional ideas, but to understand them.
Yeah.
To really understand them. To make it your aim to understand them better than your more conventionally minded colleagues and peers. You won't always be in a good position to have answers for everything. You will undoubtedly have unanswered questions and be confronted with things that you don't know how to explain, things that you can't come up with a ready answer for. Don't get overwhelmed by that. Don't be intimidated by the fact you don't have good answers, because none of us have answers to everything. And one thing that you can do, I think, as a student is ask good questions. Okay, probe the data, ask the right questions, see those unanswered questions as an opportunity to learn more about the creation, to learn more about God himself and what he has done in history. Stay in touch with other creationists who have trodden a similar path, because it can be very isolating to be certainly in a secular university as a creationist. You may feel very alone. So stay in touch with other creationists, fellowship regularly with other creationists if you can. Get yourself along to the Summer Origins Conference if you can. Be part of that community. If you're here in the UK or in Europe, come to our summer school that we're going to be advertising soon and holding this summer. Get alongside other people who can help you and can give you sort of support and prayer. But be excited, because I think as a student, the world is your oyster. We're a small community. There are fewer of us. So it means that you can pick almost any subject you like, and there will be something interesting for you to do.
Yeah.
There is no shortage of things where you could make a contribution. So I hope that's helpful. If that's you, get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
I'm sure Todd has got lots of other things to say as well.
No, I'm just going to put two things out there. One thing, I want to give a different angle on one of your responses there about how important it is to get an education. It is terribly important to get an education. You don't really understand how important it is until you've gotten your education. And you can look back and go, wow, I had no idea what was going to happen to me as a result of getting an education. I've heard people over the years tell me, I need to get a PhD because skeptics won't listen to me. They'll dismiss me if I don't have a PhD.
Right.
And I can tell you, as a person with a PhD, they don't listen to me anyway. So
that's not the reason to do it.
That's not the reason to do it. Don't just forget that illusion that somehow you're going to gain a credential and people are going to automatically look up to you. That is false. That is completely false. And the second thing I wanted to say is creation scientist is not a job. You need, as you're going through your degree, to think about, how am I going to make a living? And for me, it was for a number of years, traditional academic work. I was a professor and I taught classes. And that could be one way that you find a way to make a living. There are, of course, other ways. You could work in industry. You can do things like trying to launch your own little creation ministry. I don't necessarily recommend that. That's a lot of hard work that I am ill prepared to do. So maybe you don't want to do that, but do give a thought as you're doing your studies to, how am I going to provide for myself and for my family as a career? Because creationist is not a career. There's far too few opportunities available, far too many of us. So think about how you want to make a living. And you know what? It could be, there's always going to be the opportunity to join a creation ministry at strategic points of time. And, there are going to be a few of you that do end up doing that. And that's great. And God bless you and God help you in that endeavor. But the majority of people are going to need to think about alternative career paths. So don't forget that part.
Yeah.
But as far as the work goes, I would completely affirm what Paul said. It's exciting and wonderful. And to be able to do the kind of crazy things that I do, it seems like it's out of a dream sometimes. And so, go for it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and do get in touch with us, because we like to connect with students and others, and try to help you in any way we can. That's it. We'll finish there. We still haven't got through all of our questions. We still have a whole load left. So we'll come back to them. We'll keep accumulating them. But anyway, that's it for this time. We'll see you in another couple of weeks. We'll see you then.
All right. See you then.